The ancient nobles in Japan do not consume raw salmon even though this fish is commonly found in the waters of Japan. Under the traditional Japanese culture, salmon is rarely eaten raw and only served cooked. How then, did raw salmon came to become one of Japan's favorite dish today? The term sushi literally means sour tasting, as the overall dish has a sour and umami, or savory taste. This term comes from an ancient grammatical form that is no longer used in other contexts. The sour refers to the fermentation process of meat, usually seafood, packed in rice with salt used as a preservative. The vinegar from the fermenting rice breaks down the meat into amino acids, giving it the umami flavor. Once the meat is fermented and preserved, the rice is thrown away. Only the meat is consumed. This is the ancient way of preserving meat before the coming age of refrigerators. Modern forms of sushi are no longer prepared this way and the rice becomes part of the main dish instead. Sushi is not raw fish. It usually refers to rice served with toppings, which can be raw fish, eggs, vegetables or pretty much anything. If only raw meat or fish is served as the mains, this dish is called sashimi. It is usually eaten with a tinge of wasabi and soy sauce. There are many types of sashimis and raw fish sushi toppings. Among the most popular are tuna, salmon, red snapper, yellowtail to name a few. In particular, data published in 2020 shows that salmon is the most often eaten sushi topping in Japan. 53.2% of women and 41.3% of men had voted salmon as their favorite sushi toppings. This is far ahead of lean tuna, which was in second place. Salmon sashimi is also one of the top most popular sashimi dishes in Japan today. Ironically, salmon sashimi was not culturally a Japanese dish until the mid-1990s. In fact, the ancient nobles in Japan do not consume raw salmon even though this fish is commonly found in the waters of Japan. Under the traditional Japanese culture, salmon is rarely eaten raw and only served cooked. This is because of parasites. Parasites are commonly found in raw salmon meat and the way to kill the parasites is to cook the fish meat thoroughly. How then, did raw salmon came to become one of Japan's favorite dish today?
In the year 1974, Liste, Norwegian member of the Parliamentary Shipping and Fisheries Committee, made a trade delegation visit to Japan. The trip was meant to widen the circle of friendship between the two nations, seeing that the nation of Japan has a long culture of eating seafood. Liste became inspired with the idea of selling Norwegian seafood to the Japanese. In 1985, Liste went back to Japan and brought with him a seafood delegation of close to 20 people, representing Norwegian seafood exporters, ministers, and organizations. At the time, Norway exported around Norwegian krone 500 million in seafood products to Japan. This represented only 1% of Japan's total imports but 7% of Norway's seafood exports. The vast potential of seafood market in Japan taunted the capitalistic mindsets of the Norwegians. By that time, the Norwegians had already been systematically farming salmon to quantities that way exceeded their own needs. They wanted to sell their stockpile of Atlantic salmon back at home to the Japanese. Meticulously, the Norwegians told the Japanese,
"We have a high-quality breed of Atlantic fish perfect to fill the crave of your fish-loving culture. This fish is most suitable to be served as sashimi, as you welcome distinguished head guests at the dining table."
Needless to say, the Japanese are excited and zealously requested to see this fish. When the Norwegians proudly presented their prized Atlantic salmon, the Japanese laughed and said,
"Oh, we know this fish. This is not high quality fish as you mentioned. We have it in our waters. We do not eat this fish raw. They need to be thoroughly cooked because they carry parasites. Thanks, but we don't eat raw salmon."
These remarks left the Norwegians speechless, but they knew the Japanese were right. Put a note here. We will come back to this topic about parasites later. With a heave of disappointment, Liste and team left, failing to open the doors to the Japanese salmon market. When he returned to Norway, Liste established a government initiative called Project Japan that would continue to promote the Norwegian seafood to the Japanese. Project Japan's initial goal was to market all types of Norwegian fish, particularly capelin, and double exports to Japan in both volume and price. This paved the way for Norwegian exporters to focus on Japan. For the time being, Liste had to shelf his plans for selling salmon to the Japanese. However, the lure of making high profits through the salmon sales kept tantalizing the capitalists. For the next 10 years, the doors to the Japanese salmon market remained obstinately closed.
In the same year of 1985, Japan was at the peak of its economic growth. Japan had the world's second largest economy by nominal GDP, behind the United States, during the period from 1968 until 2010. Of which the period before 1990s was when the economy of Japan had its best years. Unfortunately, Japan suffered from sluggish economic growth and recession since the early 1990s. This was about 5 years after the Plaza Accord in 1985. Note: if you are interested to know more about the Plaza Accord, please type in Plaza Accord in the commentaries below. I will make a video on this topic if there are enough requests. In the face of the economic recession, the once almighty fishing industry of Japan was not spared. The industry employed 270,000 people in 1998, compared to 478,000 in 1978. This is a drop of more than 25% over 20 years. Adding fuel to fire, the past decades of strong economic growth had resulted to serious issues of overfishing. Coastal areas have depleted catches and caused fishing villages to shrink to edge of disappearing. Cod has been fished out in many places and salmon, sori, cuttlefish and crab are much scarcer than they used to be. Japanese fishermen had been told to remain within their exclusive economic zones by the United Nations. These factors ripple affected into the seafood industry, threatening its self-sufficiency. 40 years ago, Japan enjoyed a self-sufficient seafood industry. It produced around 7 million tons and consumed about 60 kilograms of seafood per capita annually, well above the world average of about 15 kilograms. By the mid-1990s, the picture had radically changed. Japan was only 50% self-sufficient and needed new suppliers to satisfy the huge demand at home. As a result, Japan began opening up its once closely guarded seafood industry to foreign suppliers. The Norwegians, patiently waiting all these years, jumped at this opportunity. They called Nikkei Corporation, one of Japan's top producers of frozen foods and a leader in cold storage warehousing, and made them an irresistible offer. The Norwegians offered 5,000 metric tons of salmon for next to nothing. According to Bjorn Erik Olsen, the market researcher for Project Japan, the condition in the deal was that the salmon could only be sold as sushi toppings. He was convinced, with his years of market research, that salmon as a sushi topping will take off in Japan. However, the age-old issue of parasites still remained. This time, the Norwegians were well prepared. The Norwegian government, seafood industry and organizations had spent a total 30 million Norwegian kroner towards Project Japan. The funds were used for general campaigns targeting importers, distributors, supermarket chains, stores and restaurants, as well as individual campaigns. Huge investments in marketing salmon to promote the parasite-free image of Norwegian salmon for safe consumption. Again, the topic of parasites in fish will be discussed later in the next video. Besides, parasites in raw salmon meat can be killed under the following conditions. Fish are frozen and stored at a temperature of -20 degrees Celsius or below, for at least 24 hours in a freezer. This was pretty much the conditions of the stockpile of salmon back in Norway at that time. With nothing much left to lose, Nikkei Corporation accepted the offer from Norway. And this was how Norwegian salmon first landed into the dining culture of the Japanese. Olsen, the market researcher, was right. Salmon sushi turned out to be a great hit among the younger Japanese. This was so well received by the consumers that sales went straight through the roof. In the beginning of 1995, Norwegian salmon sale to Japan was close to zero. By the end of that year, Norway had sold 28,000 tons of salmon to Japan.
the sales success of salmon quickly reverberated to the neighboring countries including China. With very similar culinary cultures, it did not take long for the Norwegian salmon to be served on the dining tables of the Chinese. By 2010, China imported more Norwegian salmon than Japan. Norway became the dominant exporter of salmon to China, where 80 to 90% is eaten raw. Today, salmon sushi and sashimi have become so ubiquitous in Japanese culinary culture that it had assimilate into the latter, as the story of its origin gets obscured through time.